Hello, I'm Ian Watson, and first of all I'd like to thank you for the invitation to present at the first International Industrial Chemistry Conference and talk to you about the global solutions from biorefineries to mitigate climate chaos. I'll first of all give you a brief introduction and talk about climate change, and then the role that biorefineries can play in that process, looking at different feedstocks and some of the bottlenecks in the whole system process, and then a brief synopsis of some of the microalgae and gasification work that we're doing at Glasgow. We're all aware of the impact of CO2 emissions on climate change and the fact that they are being derived from use of fossil fuels. Approximately 85% of the world's energy usage is currently being met by fossil fuels and the remainder by renewable energy, and obviously that process needs to be reversed as urgently as possible. This graph shows the global temperature from the period of 1970 to 2020, and if you follow the red line you can see there's quite a divergence away from the linear trend between 1970 and 2015 over the last few years. This graph shows the total CO2 emissions by different world regions, and probably the thing to note here is the cumulative total is over 35 billion tonnes per year. In 2020 the UK had 67 days without using coal. This was partly driven by the pandemic, and the energy mix was supplied by the renewable energy mix that the UK has. As with many countries around the globe, the UK has set its targets to reach net zero, and for the UK as a whole it's 2050, but the Scottish Government has set a target for 2045. The estimated cost for this is not insignificant. It's estimated to be between 50 to 70 billion pounds per year, so it's well over £1 trillion of investment before those targets can be met. And we see from the graph here what the UK total emissions of greenhouse gases have been between 1990 and 2018. So although there's been a significant reduction over that time, there's still a long way to go and a substantial investment into new technology and methods of carbon abatement in order to reach those net zero targets. And to achieve those net reductions globally requires a global effort, and I'm sure you're all aware that this year COP26 is due to be hosted in Glasgow, where all the countries around the world can get together and decide upon the mechanisms in which they can achieve these CO2 emissions. Glasgow itself has set some very ambitious targets and is looking to be carbon neutral by 2030. And also currently it's the fourth in the world in terms of the Global Destination Sustainability Index. We have seen then that there's considerable problems globally in terms of CO2 emissions, but we haven't yet looked at any solutions. One potential area that I think shows extremely high promise to solve a lot of these problems is in the concept of a biorefinery and looking at global deployment of these as well. So we can see there the definition of a biorefinery, but essentially you're looking at the use of a bio feedstock and producing from that a variety of products, which could be from food, as we've seen, to chemicals, and also bioenergy. There's various challenges associated with this, and sustainability of the feedstock is a major one and plays a significant role in selecting your biorefinery design as well. If you can process multiple feedstocks, you're probably at an advantage over your competitors. Also, you have to think about what technology you're going to employ, whether it's, for example, an AD or some type of thermochemical processing, and how you're going to control that process, and also look at profit optimization. If we look at a biorefinery design, then we can think about the inputs and the outputs to that process. We have a feedstock which in perfect circumstances would be sustainable. We would look at reducing the energy inputs into the biorefinery as well as the water usage, and see if we can utilize any waste heat from that process to improve the overall efficiency of the biorefinery. Additionally, we can consider feeding back CO2 and using that to enhance growth of the feedstock, which, for example, could be microalgae. One of the most important future scenarios is looking at coupling biorefineries with carbon capture, storage or utilisation, and approaching the BECCS concept, where you're looking at the bioenergy and the CCS combined. This offers significant potential because it's the only real way that we can move forward with a carbon negative scenario for energy production. If we look at the feedstock, there's a number of different types that you can use, ranging from wood all the way down to microalgae. Within the university, we tend to look at wood as well, but mainly agricultural waste, MSW, miscanthus and microalgae. And there may be a need for pre-treating some of these to look at the moisture content, for example. And then you can feed these feedstocks into the thermochemical process, which here I'm showing you gasification. The gasifier itself can impact the scale of the process and the amount of energy that you're looking to produce. And the output generally considers syngas, and that can be upgraded to liquid hydrocarbons or used directly in an ICE or gas turbine. There's undesirables in that gas which need to be removed, and they could be tar, ash or NOx, for example. And tar is one of the major problems with gasification of biomass. Let's initially look at some of the problems associated with gasification before looking at microalgae. And the predominant one is really tar formation. And one of the solutions there is to optimize the process so you can eliminate tar production, or at least beyond the minimum tar production point, and look at other potential ways in which you can reduce tar and ensure you have efficient cracking through the process. The biomass variety allows expanding the operational envelope of gasification, and there may be a need for pre-treatment or blending feedstocks, for example. The last item here looks at real-time control of a gasifier, and normally you have fairly expensive control systems built into gasification plants, and there's an opportunity to look at inexpensive real-time control systems that can be deployed more readily through the whole gasification system. So why microalgae? Well, microalgae offer the potential to impact a lot of the problems the world is experiencing, from CO2 sequestration all the way through to water treatment and even production of food or pharmaceutical or nutraceutical products that can impact health. There's different ways of growing microalgae. Here we can see the impact of the geographical dependency on what yields of lipids you may be able to achieve in practice. And as you'd expect, tends to be in the warmer parts of the world where you can have a much higher lipid yield compared to more temperate or colder regions. If we look at microalgal processes, they can be split up into essentially 4 regions: the growth of the microalgae, which you may do in a raceway or in photobioreactors. You then have solid separation or dewatering of the microalgae, and then an extraction and refining process to get the product that you want. So there is likely to be some high value component extraction before you go on to lower commodity values with the biofuel. If we look at the process bottlenecks, then these hinder the development of commercialization of microalgal plants. And here we can see for the input side, we need light, sugar, nutrients, CO2 and water. And each one of these is a potential contributor towards the cost of the microalgal biomass. So ideally you want availability of CO2, for example, and water and certainly nutrients within the process that you're developing. You may use sunlight, which has its limitations, as we saw in the map earlier, and also you may use light for photobioreactors, so an LED driven source, for example. On the downstream side, when you're looking at separating microalgae from the water, for example, you need generally energy to achieve that process, which is an additional cost, and you really want to be reducing the water content for your particular process. So processing in the wet state, for example, via a thermochemical process may be desirable, hydrothermal liquefaction, for example. So I'll quickly give you an overview of some of the work that we're doing at the University of Glasgow. particularly addressing the problems that we've highlighted already. We had a project looking at online tar detection. This was funded by EPSRC and a Supergen Bioenergy Hub, and principally here we were developing novel techniques to identify the tar concentration in syngas and looking at using that information as a way to control the gasifier so that the gasifier itself would operate on a minimum tar production point. So we were here using a fluorescent technique, just probing that gas with light from a LED, for example, and then looking at the fluorescent signal we got from that to identify the tar levels in the syngas. Here you can see the laboratory setup that we use. So the yellow box gives the gasifier and the hot gas filter. So the gasifier is here and the hot gas filter is behind. The gas stream exited from the top and went through the tar detection system, then a heat condenser. And we also analysed the syngas flame colour as a way to cheaply identify what the syngas composition was. On the left hand side we have the control system and the data acquisition system for the gasifier. So this test bed allows us to develop novel ways of looking at detecting the syngas and the tar concentration, for example, and also identifying perhaps the role of technology in reducing those tar levels. Just by embedding those systems downstream in this region here, we can identify how effective they would be. So here then we can see a typical process that we've looked at in terms of microalgal production, and it's all about trying to make the process more cost efficient. So anywhere where you can feed back waste heat, for example, or those various aspects make for a process advantage. Here we were looking at liquid algae still in the wet state, and we were looking at hydrothermal liquefaction as a means to separate protein and carbohydrates, looking at recovery and potential end use for that. And you can also look at using HTL for biochar production or biocrude production, which you could upgrade to biodiesel, for example, and also looking at the aqueous phase and the nutrient recovery through that process as well. So there's many different ways in which you can approach this. This is really giving you an overview of some of those processes. We're particularly interested in developing new photobioreactors to try and enhance growth, and a theme that runs through a lot of the research is looking at real-time detection systems to monitor the growth and look at harvest optimization, with due consideration always to looking at minimizing the input costs, for example for nutrient growth, water, energy and lighting. Here we can see a 6-tube photobioreactor on the left and all the control systems associated with that. So we were looking at monitoring the optical density and using that as a measure for the growth rate. So it gives you an idea of the biomass accumulation over time. You can also look at measuring the pH, for example, and the temperature, looking at temperature control and using these methods to optimize the carbon input and also the optimal temperature for the particular microalgae that you're growing. We've developed models to look at the ideal positioning of lights within a photobioreactor, and here you can see an example of an IBS storage tank with internal lighting. We've looked at different methods here, and we've currently got a system with vertical lighting going through different parts of the photobioreactor. Real-time and offline analysis provides important information on the health of the culture and also allows different strategies to be developed for real-time control. We've looked at a number of methods here, including flow cytometry. Image processing can be key, as well as Raman spectroscopy, for example. Dewatering plays an important role and adds to the cost considerably for microalgal biorefineries. We've looked at a number of systems here, including vacuum filtration, the use of organic flocculants, for example, and also new pump designs. A lot of microalgal cells have a very hard wall, and in order to extract the intracellular components, you need to break that cell wall down. So here we were contrasting different techniques, all the way from a laser, which was very effective over very short time durations, but it was very difficult to scale up and it would be very expensive, all the way down to ultrasonics. with a comparison here between microwave and also a water bath. And the impact of this is that it allows you to get the lipids out much more effectively. So once you have your algae perhaps in the light state, you could look at the impact of solvents on that separation process between the lipids and the rest of the cell components. And we did some work looking at various solvents and also applying a microwave method of enhancing that extraction. We've also done quite a lot of work on combustion, for example, and on the right hand side you can see a carbon powder that was being combusted, and you can go through the route of producing algal powder as well. We're also looking at bioplastic production from microalgae, and importantly here we're looking at various novel ways of providing nutrients to enable the microalgae to grow, and that's in a cost-effective way because we're looking at some relatively inexpensive nutrient sources. We're also looking at the design of photobioreactors and optimizing those to enable efficient gas transfer, and looking at supply of CO2, particularly through inorganic carbon delivery, and investigating the impact of bicarbonate supply, both to enable CO2 uptake for the microalgae, but also as a means for pH control. As a way of looking at higher value products, we're looking at optimizing microalgae growth and the components that we can extract from that for improved nutrition, but also looking at the impact of those components on brain function and brain diseases. And here again, as with most systems, we're looking at scaling that up and optimizing the growth, and we're particularly interested in the nutrient supply that we're using to enhance the growth, and we're working with some Colombian colleagues in this work as well. Scaling is an important aspect of microalgal biorefineries, and there's problems with cultures crashing, for example, and a whole range of other aspects that can impact the efficiency of that scaling process. We've developed a number of techniques. You saw earlier the IBS technique, which is only a meter cubed, but for a lab scale is relatively large. And here you can see an idea around developing a photobioreactor that can be installed into a urban environment. So in conclusion, there's a global effort that's needed for the future of biorefineries, and they can impact society significantly, and they offer significant advantages as well. They're complex systems, they need fine-tuning, they need looking after and control in order to make sure that they function appropriately. And there's a research path that we need to go down and follow in order to make sure that we can have the impact that's expected from microalgal biorefineries, for example, but also gasification processes, including BECCS, in order to look at reducing CO2 emissions, and indeed looking at going CO2 negative. So there's sustainable biofuel that can be developed, and higher value products including drugs and proteins and carbohydrates that can have a significant value on health. The path that we have to follow is looking at more detailed research, a lot in the areas that I've highlighted already, and the commercialization process which can begin to scale the ideas and concepts here. So thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to speaking to you on the day. Here's a collection of some references, only going up to 2018 here though, but they may be useful for you. Thank you very much.